Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations, the official podcast of the Ohio Counseling Association, bringing you updates and conversations from around the state. On today's episode, we are joined by SAIGEO members from OCA, Chase Morgan-Swaney, and Mariah Payne, so that we can discuss why Pride is more than a celebration month, as it provides cultural dignity to individuals and groups, as well as why we as counselors must increase our awareness of the experiences of LGBTQIA+ clients, colleagues, and the community. We explore current legislation, how we can act to ensure we are advocating for the safety and support of those who would be negatively impacted, and as always, important conversations they believe are meaningful to have. Chase is a licensed professional clinical counselor with training supervision designation in Ohio. Additionally, he is a national certified counselor, certified clinical mental health counselor, and approved clinical supervisor through the National Board for Certified Counselors and the Center for Credentialing and Education. Chase is currently a doctoral candidate, and his research is focused on strengthening training and education to work with queer folks affirmatively and competently in counseling. Mariah is a licensed professional counselor and specializes in providing comprehensive care to LGBTQIA+ folks and people in consensual non-monogamous relationships. Most of her work involves providing affirming and comprehensive care to transgender and gender-diverse adolescents, as well as their families. Both Chase and Mariah have completed training to conduct gender-affirming medical and surgical evaluations, which we briefly discuss in the episode. For more information on either guest, please view their full biographies in our show notes. And as always, we thank you for listening. I'm your host, Dr. Marisa Cargill, a counselor at Cuyahoga Community College and counselor educator at the University of Akron. Let's dig in. So excited to have joining us today some members and leadership from SAIGEO, Ohio. We have Chase Morgan-Swaney and Mariah Payne. Chase, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your current and past and present roles, especially tied to SAIGEO?
Yeah, sure. So I'm very glad to be here, especially during Pride Month. So thank you for the invitation. As Dr. Cargill mentioned, I am Chase Morgan-Swaney. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the current immediate past president for the Society for Sexual, Affectional, Intersex, and Gender Expansive Identities, or SAIGEO of Ohio. In the past, I have served, of course, the previous 2 years as president in the preceding year, and then the year prior to that, president-elect. And before that, I had the opportunity to serve as SAIGEO's liaison to OCA's Government Relations Committee, which is that role is currently inhabited by the force of a human being that is Jean Dockery, who has been absolutely fantastic in this role. And I'll say it's been a real pleasure to serve in SAIGEO. Today was my last board meeting, so it was bittersweet, at least in that elected position of
Yeah,
the presidency role.
of course.
So yeah, it's been wonderful, and we'll have a lot more to say about it as we move forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And Mariah, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to SAIGEO?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Mariah Payne. My pronouns are she, they. I currently am the Northeast Ohio representative for SAIGEO. I also operate our social media, so I'm our social media coordinator. I have been in this role of Northeast representative since about 2019. And I'm also part of our government relations committee, not necessarily the liaison, but just in terms of us getting that legislation out, posting all of those pieces, making sure that everyone's aware of what's going on.
Wonderful. That is so important. We know that communication is key, especially in the work we do and the advocacy. So awesome. Thank you both for joining us. I'm excited that you are here to have this conversation and really help other folks get familiar with what you do as a division of the Ohio Counseling Association. So For folks who are not so familiar with that division, Mariah, I'll start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about SAIGEO and what it's meant to you thus far in your professional career?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started to become a counselor, I knew that I really wanted to be working within the LGBTQ plus community. As a queer person myself, I have seen how this is different for us than it might be for the average cisgendered heterosexual person. And so being a part of SAGIO has really been about making sure that we are providing education, being well educated ourselves, advocating for others, and making the counseling space as affirming and equitable as possible for LGBTQ people, as well as the many intersectionalities and multiple identities that are within it.
I love that. I love that. And Chase, what do you think? What has SAGEO meant to you? But also, like, what is the division so members can better understand what it is they would be joining if they choose to?
Oh, sure. And those things align perfectly. So, what it means to me is exactly what Sagio's mission is, and that is to serve LGBTQIA+ plus populations um, throughout the state of Ohio with regard to counseling and clients in counseling, but of course, extending beyond that, inhabiting our roles as advocates, right, and living that out as well. And that's something that we've been leaning into heavily over the past year or so, in particular, which we'll get into a little bit later. But yeah, so that's really the goal of SAGIO is to advance the dignity and welfare of queer and trans folks in Ohio. And we have quite a group that Mariah and I, have the pleasure of working alongside to advance those efforts. So that's what it means to me, and that's what it is.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for sharing information about the division. I hear a lot of words that I feel like are ringing and might be a theme of this conversation today, but about education and advocacy. And Chase, I really appreciate that used the word dignity as we begin this conversation because I think it is so important. And again, so grateful to have you here. Now, Chase, I'm going to kick it back to you. Can you tell us how pride is something that we can connect to our responsibilities as counselors?
Yes. And I think that that is a very easy bridge to build. Um, as we think about pride, and we think about dignity and we think about welfare, I think it's important that we connect that to our professional values that guide, right, the counseling field. So think about, right, the preamble to the ACA Code of Ethics, talking about not just preserving, which is of course there, goes without saying, the inherent dignity and welfare, right, of queer and trans folks, but really taking that a step above and enhancing and protecting, right, that dignity and welfare. But beyond that, multiculturalism and social justice and advancing those aims as well. And I think that it's more important than ever to acknowledge that pride is more than a focus solely on celebrating. It involves celebrating, right, queer and trans identities, um, but it's more in that we also bring in, as was mentioned by Mariah earlier, these multiple minoritized identities, right, in terms of intersectionality and how it contributes to the uniqueness of our lived experiences and the value that that can offer in terms of society, in terms of advancing the profession. Um, and it goes without saying, as counselors, we have that role as advocates, right? And we have that bent toward social justice. And so I think it dovetails beautifully with pride in those ways.
I really like that you said it's more than celebrating. And it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is it's also a recognition of the unique identity of our clients or our specific client individually, but also on a larger scale of populations, that there are unique identities within there that we should educate ourselves on, be able to support, and it represents those values of our profession as well. So, Mariah, I know Chase has just said a lot here. How would you say you connect pride to our responsibility as counselors?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Chase hit on all of the big points that I was also going to bring up, right? Like our core values in our ethics codes, it's built into that. This multiple disciplinary approach, this diversity, inclusion, like all of these things are part of how we ethically approach our job and our work. I think the only piece that Chase didn't mention yet was about how we in counselor educator roles, student roles, supervisor roles, if we are not a queer person ourselves, it is very likely that even in interacting with each other, we will be interacting with a queer person. And so it boils down to our clients, absolutely, but it's also about the professional relationships that we're building with each other, how we're receiving supervision or giving supervision, how we approach a classroom setting when we're talking about these kinds of things, or when we're taking our courses on sex and relationships. Like, are we including the LGBTQIA plus identities in those approaches? And really, I think that there are very few places where this doesn't connect to counseling, where pride isn't related to it. And I mean, we always go back to the first pride was a protest. We always talk about how pride is, yeah, it's about awareness, it's about celebration, but it's also about human rights, human dignity, the things that we see as intrinsic and important for all people.
I see that Chase wants to add something here. And Mariah, I couldn't have loved that response more. And I'll put a pin in, let Chase say what he needs to say here.
One, Mariah hit the nail on the head as usual. And so I just want to add to that, that history is really important here. And I was starting to get right. The first Pride was a protest, and that just stirred something up within me. And of course, my like flying finger went up, and I'm like, please, please call on me next. And I just think it's so important. I'm in the middle of my dissertation research, and it's about enhancing competencies, education, training, particularly to work with queer folks in a counseling relationship. And a lot of the literature, speaking to the historical component, cites the liberation movement for queer and trans folks was a catalyzing force for the development of multiculturalism, right? In the field, the embracing of multiculturalism in the field, which eventually we know transformed into the social justice lens that we work through currently. And so it's really important to recognize that the personal and the professional, right, is political. And these things don't just exist, right, in the silo and isolation of one another, that these historical events in society have influenced in a positive way and, in an adverse way at points, our profession and the trajectory of our profession. So I just wanted to throw that in there as well because Mariah inspired me to do so.
You have both inspired me. There's so many fireworks going off in my brain right now to say, oh my gosh, I can add to this as a counselor educator. I really appreciate what you said, Mariah, that it's not just the work we do with our clients. It extends past that. And there are so many spaces. And so, yes, we are counselors. And I so frequently will advise my students that, yes, there's that, but we cannot take our humanity away from this too. And how important that is for us to consider that this enters all spaces. So well said and well received. So I just love everything you all have to say. I'm so excited about this conversation. And with this conversation, I think it brings a lot of relevant information that's happening in society. So when we think about other spaces and what's happening, I was doing some preparation for the show and found a little bit of data for us to just share out with our listeners. But the Pew Research Center found in 2022 that overall About 8% of Americans say they are following news about bills recently proposed by several states related to people who are trans, either extremely or very closely. So they're following the news really closely, about 8%. That was in May of 2022 that they collected this data, and about 2/3, 68% said they're following the news just a little bit or not at all. That said, 64% of those, or majority of Americans, favor policies that protect transgender individuals from discrimination in jobs, housing, public spaces like restaurants and stores. And of those, 37% strongly favor. So we've got a little data here saying only a small portion of people are following it, but about 2/3 are going to favor policy that protects these individuals. What do you think is behind this gap of favoring better policy but not really following it closely? Mariah, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas where there's a lot behind it. And so when I was thinking about this question and how I was going to approach it, I figured I was going to come at it from a very like lay person. Why might the average person have a hard time? One of the main things that I think about is how misleading this legislation is named. When we talk about the names that our legislators are giving these bills, they do not properly inform the average person of what this legislation will do. So I think about the Parents' Rights Act and how the name of that, if I was a parent, would make me think, oh, wow, I will be getting rights. Yeah, that's right. They should make my rights part of the law as a parent. And when we look at the language of that bill and what that bill would do in actuality, we're talking about outing trans children. We're talking about outing people's identities to their parents and forcing our school educators and our school staff to do that. The average person would have to look into the bill, read about the bill, or read the bill itself. And I'm not sure if you've ever tried, but they are hard to digest. They're not written for the average person. They're written in these really convoluted ways, and you have to sometimes read between the lines. So just on face value of the legislation that's being proposed, we hear the title, we hear the numbers, and we might not hear more than that. Adding on top of that, like connection to the LGBTQ community, whether or not we have it, whether or not we know that those bills are happening or how they might end up affecting it, all of that plays in.
Right. Yeah. So that's, I think, a really important element, that we don't know what we don't know. And so they're sometimes intentionally misleading with titles, and we have to be on it, especially as counselors, but also, as humans, is helpful as well. Chase, what do you think is behind this gap?
Yeah, and as Mariah was sharing about Ohio House Bill 8. Ohio House Bill 8 is the Parental Bill of Rights, as it is being referred by the legislature. And I think it's important, being here in a discussion in the context of Ohio Counseling Association, that I wanted to make sure to tack that on to Mariah's comments, just so folks can follow along, right? Because we are talking about how can we, right, what do we think is behind this gap, right, of favoring better policy, yet not following it closely. And so my thoughts, similarly, as Mariah mentioned, a lot came to mind, right? And I was thinking about actually a presentation that Marisa, you and I did several years ago, about allyship and how folks will sort of inhabit that identity as an ally, right? And proclaim that. And that's important because queer and trans folks, we need allies, right? However, allies in name only, without some action, some behavior, right? Advancing opposition to these types of bills, is just that. It's just ally in name only. And so I think about this evolution of that term allyship and how it's evolved to accomplishship and co-conspiratorship. And it's hard for folks to do that, to make that advance, to accomplishship, to co-conspiratorship, which involves, right, being cognizant of our social location and the power and the privilege that we have, or that we don't have, right? If we live and inhabit a minoritized identity in the context of our society, being aware of those things, wielding it, right? If we have it, if we're in that position of an ally, and sometimes folks who hold that ally identity, they don't feel competent and they don't feel efficacious in their skills, right? To be an advocate. So helping to learn how to do more, right? Accessing those resources that are available, that I just want to mention because folks probably aren't aware, especially in the context of this question, right? What's the gap between favoring better policy and not following it closely or not following up on it closely? I kind of took it a little further. So we want to think about Equality Ohio, Trans Ohio, Stonewall Columbus, the LGBT Center of Greater Cleveland, Canopy in Akron, the youth centers, so Kaleidoscope and Colors Plus. These are organizations that you can connect with to become more competent and efficacious in your ability to engage in these issues and advance these efforts. So I hope that that's helpful.
I think it's very helpful and something, again, my counselor educator heart always just comes through, I think, in some of these episodes, because part of what we aim to do in this podcast is to disseminate and educate the people who are listening, disseminate information to, I should say, and educate the people who are listening. And so I think advocacy is such a broad word. And to your point, Chase, people don't always know how to advocate or in what ways, or they may not feel like they have the ability to be a voice for someone whose identity they don't inhibit. What I think we can demystify is that advocacy can look really simple in a lot of ways too, and that it extends beyond a lot of things someone might traditionally think or see as advocacy. It is just about educating yourself. It can be writing a letter or email. There's a program that I often use that lets me use texting to write my representatives and turns it into a formal letter. And I can link that in the show notes. It's something that any of us can use. It's when we have a conversation with a colleague to just give them a little bit more advocacy. And I'm not saying those are the only ways in which we should advocate, but I also want to extend that definition and demystify so people understand it looks a lot of different ways, and it can be as simple as learning a little more on a website. So it doesn't have to be this grand thing that feels beyond you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, right, when we're talking about access and ability, these small areas of advocacy and allyship are really important. Maybe it is just me learning what legislation is out there in my state and then talking to my people about it, educating those in my circle. And maybe it's only my parents or my family or my partner, but if I can talk about it with some people, maybe they will also talk about it with some more people. And so if that's the only way that I can access allyship, then that's where I start, right? And we build from there. We start talking about it in our own local communities. We start writing our local representatives. We start writing our state representatives. And we just say, like, hey, this stuff is out here and that's not for me. You're my rep. Make sure that when you are voting on this legislation that you're representing me too.
Mm-hmm. And then extending it to, like, and in my profession, I know this education, these statistics, for example, that we may recognize from the Pew Research Center or news outlets or clinical research, from our professional literature, that we can share to say, and as a counselor, I know the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis will be impacted by this, and here's how. So we can extend it to our multiple roles, but like you're saying, right, it can start small and build from there and let it snowball, so to speak.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And like,
I love it.
in our profession, we do have this large area of research that shows us that this matters, that tells us like, hey, the data is behind this being important. The data is behind this being necessary. And I'm even going to go like medically necessary too, right? We're currently looking at nationwide tons of legislation trying to take away medical rights to access gender affirming care. So yeah, let's talk about the research too. Talk about this with your other counselors in your workplace. Talk about this with the people who own the agency or the practice that you're working at. Do they know that it's happening? Do the counselors in your own life understand the impact of this? Are they familiar with the research? If they're not, right, this is where we start too.
Yeah, maybe share this podcast episode with your colleagues if they need an entry point, a soft plug, but also still relevant. Like this could be, oh, wow, I didn't know that was happening. And so this leads me to my next question. And I know we touched on House Bill 8 in Ohio, but can you speak to current legislation and why it's really important for counselors to be aware of and in the know? Chase, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, and I think it's important to contextualize a bit that this is a concerted effort across the country. And Mariah, they made mention of this a moment ago, that not just a concerted effort in terms of its focus, right, and its kind of sharpness, but it's also very coordinated and collaborative. And it's being led by a lot of conservative value, traditionally conservative value based organizations that are sort of creating templates of these bills that we're seeing pop up in our Ohio General Assembly, particularly more so in the House chamber. Of course, the Senate is not immune, but right now we see a focus in the House. But on a broader level, these foundations, these conservative organizations, they're disseminating these templates across the country to different, typically conservative Republican legislators who are taking them up and maybe making small tweaks that are relevant to their state law, to their jurisdiction, and they're largely the same. And so we're dealing with this coordinated effort, and I think it's really important that folks are aware of that. And there was an individual, I don't remember the name, and frankly, I don't really care to say the name of the individual. But there was an individual who was making comments, I believe, at CPAC, at the Conservative Political Action Conference, and was giving a speech at the most recent one, and said that transgenderism needs to be eradicated. And the response to that was just applause, roaring applause. And that clip, I'm sure we could share in the notes for the show. It was absolutely horrific. But that conference, CPAC, is the leading conservative / Republican conference for political action. And so when we have someone who is sharing that transgenderism ought to be eradicated on the stage and getting thunderous applause, we know that this isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And I hate to sound like a downer, right? However, we have to know this and we have to grasp what that means for the lives of trans and gender diverse people. And so I want to turn it over to Mariah to talk specifically about legislation in Ohio, because Mariah has been on the forefront and has testified against 2 of these bills. So Mariah, I can jump in where you need me to, because I know all like the specifics of like the House committees and like all that stuff. So if you need me to jump in to give any of the background stuff, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Chase did a really great job of explaining why this is happening, how this is going about happening, and why it matters so much, right? I think sometimes when people hear about these bills, they might hear an offshoot of it and then go, oh, like a problem must have happened. And now the legislation is trying to correct that problem. What we're looking at is a lot of these things do not have a basis in community issues. They are not representing our communities or the needs of Ohio. And so right now we in Ohio have 6 different anti-LGBTQ pieces of legislation that are either in the House or in the Senate. And like when we talk about their bill numbers, I'm going to kind of list them out and then talk about a few of them. We have House Bill 183, we have House Bill 151, House Bill 8, House Bill 6, House Bill 68, and then Senate Bill 83. And the one that I'm going to talk the most about today is going to be House Bill 68, because this is the one that directly impacts healthcare and the ability to receive gender affirming care. So this bill does tie us in, and it ties in the larger medical community as well. When we're looking at House Bill 68, it is inaccurately being called the Ohio Saving Adolescents from Experimentation Act. Sometimes they're abbreviating it as SAFE. This is about banning access to medical care for trans and gender diverse people. They do target youth because they are creating the framework of gender affirming care being experimentation. And this is a false equivalency. We have research, we have a lot of research that shows gender affirming care is treatment. It is not us frivolously providing gender affirming services. It is the treatment for gender dysphoria. It is the treatment for a difficult experience being in our existence. I think there's a small part of me that, like, when I start thinking about the bills themselves, I get overwhelmed, right? Chase said, like, I've been doing this, we've been doing this, and there's so much here that sometimes piecing out the different aspects of it can be overwhelming. Excuse me, my cat has decided to join us. One moment.
Yeah, let me hop in, right? So, yes, when Mariah says that HB 68 is calling us in and including us, I think it's easy to think, oh, like that, like you're talking about LGBTQ folks. No, I'm talking about our profession. I'm talking about professional. We're talking about professional counselors. Professional counselors, in the context of this bill, would be penalized for the provision of gender affirming care, which is the care that is indicated, right, for trans and gender diverse people. And so when I talk about penalizing, I mean it's up to the level of like licensure, suspension, like criminal fines, imprisonment. We're talking this kind of level of criminalization, essentially, of care. And so it's really important that we understand that in the context of this being right for the consumption of folks in the counseling profession. And so it's in the House Public Health Policy Committee, is where it's currently stationed. They've had 3 hearings on the bill thus far, and there is a 4th hearing that is scheduled for this Wednesday, the 14th of June. And on behalf of OCA, we've actually had Jean Dockery, who is the current SAIGEO liaison to OCA's Government Relations Committee, testified in opposition of this bill on behalf of OCA. And of course, we thank them for their efforts in that regard and for leading the charge there. I didn't know, Mariah, did you want to touch on any of the other bills?
Yeah, I absolutely can. So I think when we're looking at the other bills, it's really hard to say like, oh, this one is more important than the other. They all have a certain level of importance. When I think about school counselors, so like I myself am a clinical mental health counselor, but school counselors who are operating in that school space, we are also talking about the Parents' Bill of Rights or House Bill 8, where they're trying to force educators and those who work in the school system to ouch students. And so this is a bill that is currently in House committee. It really focuses on the, I'm trying to find a good way to phrase this. When we're talking about House Bill 8, we are looking at the legislators not understanding the purpose and function of our educators and school counselors. And so some of the testimonies in support of this bill are creating situations that are not realistic or not happening in support of this bill. And when we look at the people who are opposing it, we have real life examples of students and educators and providers saying, this is not accurate. There is no one lying to parents about what is happening with their kids. There is no one putting their kids or students in more harm by not disclosing information. It is really about readiness and about each individual's right and autonomy to come out as they want, when they want. When we're talking about House Bill 6, which is the trans sports ban, misleadingly called Save Women's Sports, this is where we're talking about banning trans people from being able to participate in sports. This is the bill that I had the unfortunate necessity but pleasure in terms of advocacy to go to the House and testify against. I actually ended up going twice. There was so many people there the first time that we were not able to get through all of the opposing testimonies. I witnessed multiple trans girls from the state of Ohio testifying against this bill, talking about how there's already Ohio regulation that ensures that these trans individuals are able to participate safely, talking about the fact that they waited to get into their sports already, talking about how their sport community was one of the safest and most welcoming places they had, and banning them would remove them from that.
Thank you for sharing all of that information. And I think it's important for us to understand that necessity that you were mentioning when you had to testify and what that looks like and how that also is in opposition to our ethical codes. And so could you, either of you, speak to when those when those testimonies are heard, what level, I guess, we're bringing in our ACA ethical codes or even KCREP credentialing? Because for example, I'm pretty familiar with Senate Bill 83 and its opposition to teaching anything diversity related. That is oppositional to our accrediting bodies. So as a counselor educator, how do those partner? But in these others that you've mentioned, they're highly oppositional not only to our KCREP credentialing and requirements there, but as in addition, our code of ethics as a profession. So I'll let either one of you take that, or both of you.
Well, I'll just say, I think, yes, right. When we think about Senate Bill 83 and we think about the implications of if that bill were to be enacted on our accrediting body, right, KCRAP, and our ability to continue to teach courses like multicultural counseling, I would be very confident, right, in saying, and I think I could speak for the vast majority of counseling professionals when I say, can't really have a counseling program or then later a profession without teaching multicultural and social justice counseling. And so this is a bill that ought to be taken very seriously. We need to watch closely what's going on across the country, particularly in the state of Florida. Florida is hopefully not, but it looks like just a bit ahead, chronologically speaking, of where we may find ourselves. And so they are passing and enacting these types of laws that Florida institutions are having to contend with in terms of not being able to discuss DEI. And I know it's more broad than that, but I think when we think about these other bills, HB 6, which is the sports ban bill, HB 8, as we've spoken about a lot, the Parental Bill of Rights, 68, which is gender affirming care, and then 183, which is the newest. It's a bathroom ban in schools and universities. We haven't spoken much about that, but it's really important. It was just referred to the House Higher Education Committee on June the 7th. Thankfully, there's been no movement yet as to committee hearings. But my broader point is that we have to be talking about these things as counselors. We can't take a pass on these things because HB 6, HB 8, 183, they don't have direct implications per se on counselors and our actions and our day-to-day roles and functions. Yet they do, because they violate the very spirit and essence of the profession and what we do. And we are going to be serving the people who are impacted by these bills. And so it does very much impact us. And so I want to shout out OCA. I think it's very important. And not just because we're on an OCA sponsored podcast, but truly, we could not have done and continue to do what we've done in the advocacy space for queer and trans folks without OCA and the support of the leadership and Dr. Sean Gorby, the GRC chair, and Amanda and Julia, our paid lobbyists through the Government Advantage Group for OCA, who have been working so closely with Jean, with Mariah, with myself, with others in SAIGEO, and folks in the executive board. It's just been remarkable the degree of support that we've had in terms of, yep, here's the statement, let's present it in our ongoing email thread to the powers that be, and they're like, yes, get it done, and then we go testify, and we're able to do that on behalf of OCA as SAIGEO, as a division of the association. And so we can't express our gratitude enough, and I'm sure Mariah
Yeah,
agrees.
absolutely. It's one of those spaces where we are stronger together. And could SAIGEO do it? Yeah, we would, right? If we were left without OCA, we would still be doing what we're doing, but we are stronger together. We do better because of their support. And our voices are louder, more impactful. We're not just speaking on, here is the LGBTQ affirming advocacy. No, we're talking about all counselors, because it is about all of us. It does affect all of us. And even if it's not affecting each individual counselor as a person, like Chase says, it is affecting our clients. It is affecting our peers. It is affecting our colleagues, our students, our supervisees. And like when we talk about that on an individual level, we're already seeing the impact in trans and gender diverse kids. They are already telling us, this scares me. I'm worried. Will I be able to stay here? Can I get my gender affirming care here? Will I be okay enough? Or is the state telling me that I don't have a right to exist?
Yeah. And I think that if we want to bring it back to even some of our beginning conversation today, that's back to our ethical responsibility of understanding the communities in which we work, that we must know what's happening and know how clients and communities are being impacted to better serve them. That is part of our ongoing responsibility as counselors. And so certainly you both highlight the need to understand this legislation and know that while it may not impact you as maybe a community member of like your own community, it impacts you as a counselor regardless. And so that is a well received information. And what I hope that we will do here is also link all of these bills in the show notes so that people can better understand um, the policy that they're suggesting and how we can help GRC, SAIGEO, all of the above OCA advocate for our opposition.
Yeah, and I'm going to add something if you don't mind. Kaleidoscope Youth Center live tweets all of these events. So when they are going to the House, when we are having the opposition hearings, they live tweet that so that members of the community do not have to hear the difficulty that is happening as we are getting questioned by the representatives. Some of that can be triggering and difficult to listen to. And so what Kaleidoscope Youth Center does is they provide space for you to know what's going on without having to hear some of that difficult narrative or without having to listen and watch the whole thing.
And when we're heeding those calls to action that OCA, for example, and SAIGEO put forth through our membership listserv on OCA, through our social media, know that we are moving the needle, right? I mean, yeah, we're moving the needle, and that couldn't be more true, right? It seems like it's moving, just one tick at a time. However, that matters because if we think about the sports ban, HB6, on May 10th, it was favorably voted out of the House, right? And that, well, I should say out of the House Higher Education Committee to be considered by the full House now, the full House of Representatives. And so that means this bill has the most traction and movement thus far out of committee. And that vote was by a vote of 8-6, right? And it's important to know that our opposition, our testimony, there are some folks, though it doesn't seem like it, that are moved by this, right? We had one member of the Republican conference vote in opposition of this bill. The rest were Democrats, yes, but we had one Republican vote in opposition. And the other 8, of course, were in the Republican conference. But I think it's important that we keep in mind that this matters and that it may not seem like folks are listening, and that might give us, feel like that's a justification to kind of throw in the towel. However, we need to pay attention to small things like this because it shows that we have the ability to, as I said, continue to move the needle in the direction of liberation.
Awesome. So I want to share a little more information. So just earlier this week, the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, we're recording on June 10th, so this may post a little later, but declared a state of emergency for LGBTQ plus community in the United States because of the rise in legislation. Oh my gosh. In legislation. See, not perfect, right? I'm human. Um, Across the nation, targeting specifically transgender individuals, but the population at large as well. And I believe that leads me to the question, which I think you've said some and spoken to this a bit, but how can counselors and or society do better to help address these measures and protect those being harmed by it? Mariah, I'll start with you and then Chase.
Yeah. So step 1, know about it. Awareness is always the first step. We got to know what's going on. We got to know how impactful it can be. So you're listening to the podcast, great first step. You are aware now. Start thinking about what you're going to do. As weird as this may sound, we may become unsafe for a portion of our population. Our clients may need to start considering how they are going to go move somewhere else. And especially when we're talking about clients who have already been receiving gender affirming care and are already receiving hormones, if this right and availability of that medication is removed from them, there are really significant mental health experiences that they can have due to a hormonal dysregulation. So be mentally aware of what options are available, what states are having less of these legislative difficulties, or what places may be more safe, more affirming. And then on a professional end, right, how are you going to handle if not being able to provide gender affirming care becomes written into our legislation? How are you as a provider going to move forward in providing your services if the state says you're not allowed to do this anymore?
Yeah, because unfortunately, this, I hope that it won't in terms of HB, 68. But if that becomes a reality, which we're seeing in other states, it is becoming a reality that counselors are having to contend with. And if it does here, we're going to have to get really creative, folks. We're going to have to get really creative and lean into that creativity as a counselor to continue to provide these vital, life-saving services. Because the fact of the matter is, our board, the counselor, social worker, and marriage and family therapist board, is an entity of the state government. And it is compelled, understandably so, to follow the laws that are passed by the General Assembly and signed into law by the governor. And they will be directed, right, to uphold that law. And so we have reason to suspect that that will be the guidance that the board has to offer, is that we don't really have much space here. We don't really have a remedy otherwise than to follow the law and to apply the law to folks that we license and that we regulate through our authority. And so we just have to begin to think about how we can start to imagine contending with these things.
Yes, and I appreciate, Mariah, that you said knowing it is right really important. So great, good job. Pat yourself on the back for listening and maybe looking at the show notes. But then what are we going to do about it? Because the knowing doing gap is often where many people fall short. And I'm not saying counselors, all of us. I always use the analogy when I'm teaching, like, I know I probably shouldn't drink soda, but I just can't quit my Diet Coke. Okay. And so I know better, but I don't always do better. And so now that we know, what are we going to do about it? Because when we think about multicultural competence, we cannot escape that action is tied to that. And so our knowledge, our skills, our awareness is wonderful and great. But now with that, what will we do? And so that is an important part of the formula that I want to stress we can't forget. Chase, what did you want to add?
Yeah, so let's talk about that real quick, right? Like the action piece. And you know what? Another hat that we wear as counselor is counselor citizen. We don't really think about that. But we are, right? We're citizens too, and that involves that civic action piece. And one of the fundamental rights that we have, whether it's, gender affirming care, right? Or voting, that's something that's important as well, right? And as I mentioned earlier, the personal and the professional are political. So consider supporting candidates, right, whose platform, right, and position on policies aligns with our professional values. Um, Not just that, do they have a record of doing so? Have they acted, right? Have they acted in accordance with what it is that they are espousing? Right? And so I think that's important, and not just candidates for the legislature. More importantly, as these laws pass, as these laws are signed into law by the governor, we're done. There's nothing else we can do, right? Like this is the action piece right now that we have, is to intervene while these bills are in committee. Otherwise, we have to wait for someone to file a lawsuit and it go to the courts, and then it has to be worked out in the courts, right? And so it's also important to go and vote for our judicial candidates as well, because very likely some of these matters, a good deal of these matters, are going to end up winding their way through the judicial system and be worked out that way. And so it's really important that we don't just attend to, the primary and general elections, but also these special elections, like the one on August 8th, for
So
example.
glad you mentioned
That's looking
it.
okay. Yes, right. Because right now, um, they're not saying it's about abortion, it's about abortion, right? And they want to make it so that any constitutional amendment to this Ohio State Constitution now has to achieve the threshold of 60%, right? And that is because in November, there is a ballot initiative to amend the Constitution to ensure that abortion is a state right that we have. And that could easily be something related to trans and gender diverse folks or LGBTQ folks generally moving forward. And so These are things that are actionable that we need to attend to on a macro
Yeah, and
level.
just to add to that too, right? Access to abortion rights is a trans issue as well. It is a queer issue as well. When we are talking about transgender, transmasculine people who have the ability to become pregnant, having that option can be life-saving. We're not talking about these issues as two separate things. They're interconnected with each other. We have to know how one thing seemingly unrelated to the trans community does directly impact the trans community, and how like raising this threshold it also means that the laws we want might not happen. The things that protect us might be harder to achieve. And I think alongside with what Chase was saying about like voting and knowing your votes and knowing your representatives, knowing what is coming up on the ballot, we're also talking about knowing your policies. If a ban on gender affirming care happens, this is directly in conflict with our ethical codes. And so if I own a practice, if I work at a practice, if I work at an agency, what are our guidelines for this? How are we as a company or a collection of providers going to move forward with this? How does this change our documentation? How does this change our treatment, if at all? How does this change how we promote ourselves, how we show people we're a safe space, right? It might become more difficult to advocate or say like, hey, I'm a trans affirming provider if trans affirming providers are now under scrutiny.
Ohio Counseling Conversations was created to support the sharing of information for OCA members and counselors in Ohio. So, we are excited to share news about your ability to create public service announcements, or PSAs, for the podcast. If you or your division, chapter, or committee would like to announce an upcoming event or continuing education opportunity on the podcast, you can fill out a form available on OCA's Linktree, also linked in the show notes of this episode. There are guidelines about when to submit to ensure your announcement appears on the next episode, and information about the length of your announcement. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to the podcast team at ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
I want to shift to a little bit of a different topic of away from legislation, but how we can promote better work in our daily practice. And so we know a lot of the research supports the use of affirming language interventions in the work that we do with the LGBTQIA plus population with our clients. So how do you believe counselors can best incorporate those affirming practices and that affirming care into what we do on the daily? Chase, I'm going to toss it to you first this time.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things that we can do at the very beginning is to remember that there is such beautiful diversity and heterogeneity across experiences in the diaspora, right, across the LGBTQIA plus communities. And that, yes, there are a lot of quick mental heuristics that come to mind, stereotypical beliefs and attributes that come to mind. And as counselors, we have to be really cognizant of the within group differences, and that we can't just paint with a wide brush, so to speak. So that's something that I think is paramount, is to remember the uniqueness and diversity of those experiences, and to also ensure that we have a general understanding of how the lexicon, right, the terminology, which is always changing, always evolving, have a general understanding of what that means, and also be willing, in a sort of dialectical way, right? Be willing to sit and be with our client and hear their experience of their own identity and how they live that out, how they be that, because they are in a process of being and becoming, and we don't want to stymie that by applying our very oftentimes boxy understanding of these identities, these populations. What do you think, Mariah?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And actually, as you were talking, an example came to mind for me, where I had a client where it was during our first appointment, and they said to me, like, oh, I identify as a demi boy. And I said, oh, okay. What does that mean for you? And they were like, wait, you know what a demi boy is? And I was like, yeah, I'm familiar with what that term means. And then they were like, oh, okay. And suddenly, when they're telling me what that means for them, they are telling me with the understanding that I have an area of context for this already. This is something I'm already familiar with. And now I want to know about you, not necessarily saying, so what is a demi boy? That I have no context for that, and now you need to explain it to me. These are slightly different approaches where when we have the vocabulary, when we have the knowledge, we can come from a framework of, okay, cool, like I've got this basis. Is that the same for you? Is it different for you? How does it come up for you? And that's really what one of the things that I thought of as Chase was speaking.
I really appreciate that, because I think both of you hit on it, that terminology is so important, and using the language and understanding the language that our clients use is so critical to the work that we do and how we can best support them. So I really appreciate that further example too, because I think that helps all of us contextualize that process a little bit better as well.
Yeah. And if I can add just a little bit more,
Yeah.
you do not have to specialize in the LGBTQ community to need LGBTQ plus training. If you work in any specialization, there are queer people experiencing that. You need this training, even if you think these things are unrelated. Domestic violence, substance use, anything. When we're talking about it, queer people are also in.
Career,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where we often, like, we are so passionate about our specialization, and then we might not even realize, like, oh, I don't know what domestic violence looks like in a relationship with two women. Oh, I'm not sure I know the way that substance use might present for a trans person, or how that treatment might be slightly different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think that it just speaks to that we all have an intersecting identity and experience. And so you may not identify the same as someone else, but that doesn't mean your awareness isn't needed. And so, amen. I want to like snap my fingers for everything that's been shared. So, I guess tied to that previous question of like how we incorporate affirming care, are there specific trainings or resources that either of you might recommend so that we can become better about doing this with our clients, with our partners, loved ones, family, like any of that? Mariah, I'll start with you this time.
Okay. If you are working with trans people and they are going to be asking you for a letter for gender affirming surgery, you have to take trainings for this. You cannot just write a letter because you are an affirming therapist. You have to know what letter writing means, what letter writing looks like. And if you are under supervision, you and your supervisor should be getting these trainings. As odd as this might sound, Simple Practice Learning has a training on gender affirming letter writing that is conducted by a trans person. And so that was one of the first ones that I did. I really enjoyed it. WPATH, Chase, will you help me with what that stands for? I forgot.
Yeah, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health.
They have a brand new standards of care. I think it's the 8th one that they've put out. And so if you are not familiar with this, you need to be. And one of the things that I'm working on now is getting more training around neurodiversity, as that's one of the new standards of care for trans people.
Snapping again, snap, 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 snap. So Awesome. And we will be sure to get links or appropriate references so that we can put those resources in the show notes. If you're listening and you're like, where do I find it? You'll be able to find it in the show notes. And Chase, other resources, trainings that you recommend in terms of improving our affirming care.
Yes, and it's a quick plug for SAIGEO.
Absolutely.
Right, right, Mariah? SAIGEO also, which we haven't, I don't think we've made mention of yet, National SAGE, sort of our parent SAGE organization. They're an ACA division, and we are a state branch of them. And they have wonderful resources. SageCounseling.org is really helpful too. And ACA, the American Counseling Association, has recently, if you receive their emails, they've been putting out a resource guide as well this month for Pride Month. So check them out as well, ACA.
Yeah, I think Sagio, we're a underutilized resource. Our trainings are LGBTQ specific every time. So if you are someone who's like, oh yeah, I just don't know the vocabulary, we very often have 101 courses where we're just talking about, let's learn language. Let's learn how to have more gender affirming language. And then,
We've done it
yes, we
together.
have.
Mariah and I.
And how do we create this space? By providing these trainings. We really want to talk the talk, walk the walk, make this available for people. In my opinion, they are some of the most affordable trainings that I have ever seen. And then I'm going to add another one here. It's called Affirmative Couch. And so they provide trainings for LGBTQ as well as non-monogamy and kink, which we often see overlaps in these communities. And so that can be a great resource too if you are someone who's like, I have a basis of knowledge, but I'm really struggling in these more broad areas.
Wonderful. Awesome. I'm so excited about just the show notes, as being a really great resource for all of our listeners and members, as well as I think general population that could benefit from really understanding. I'll plug one just that I found as I was doing research for the show, that the Human Rights Campaign had given a guidebook for action in terms of helping in your communities to address legislation that may be causing harm. And I appreciate looking at that, and that some of them are really grassroots level too. So it feels like I don't have to have a law degree to really get involved in my community and address the harm that this could create. And so I will make sure to link that one in the show notes as well. So, any other resources before I move to our last question of the day?
I'm going to talk a little bit just to make sure that you're following these people, that you're familiar with these people. I'm going to say their names again, right? Equality Ohio, Trans Ohio, Equitas, Kaleidoscope Youth Scanner. We rely on these entities and the work that they do so that we can also be providing you the most accurate information. And without them, my social media would be a lot different, because very often they are at the forefront of these items. They are creating the information graphics, and they're really helping us drive how important this is.
Mm-hmm. And I would say a quick shout out and nod to SAIGEO, because your social media presence has shared a lot of those regularly, so that people who are following your social media are learning from them as well. So pat on the back there, and follow SAIGEO. We'll link all of these accounts, but certainly SAIGEO is a good place to start too, especially when we're talking about what's going on in the state. So our name of the podcast is Ohio Counseling Conversations, and we think conversations are really important, sometimes the most important things in terms of getting the dial, that needle that Chase was mentioning, moving right in the directions that we hope. So my question to you, if it hasn't been mentioned in something you've shared already today, are what are some important conversations you believe counselors should be having with each other or their clients right now? And Chase, I'll start with you.
Yep. And mine's very Simple. I work from a relational cultural lens. That's my theory. And one of the things that I don't hear enough as a clinical counselor and also a supervisor and an educator, so someone who wears all of those hats, I still see so much of identifying the source of suffering and distress internally and in relationships, but I don't see as much, not it's woefully lacking, identifying the source of distress and suffering in society. And you can't see it. Mariah and Marisa can see it. But I'm in my office and there's three chairs in here, and so I always tell clients that the third chair is always inhabited by society. And we have to make room for that and make space for that because, of course, it doesn't just exist in here. It exists all around us, of course, but we've internalized society too. And so it's important to acknowledge and to situate contextually the role that oppressive forces have played, right? In terms of the quote unquote, you can't see my air quotes, but I'll tell you, I'm air quoting like pathology, right? Or just the concerns that we're experiencing. It comes from heterosexism, right? It comes from cisgenderism. It comes from ableism, right? And so these things, it comes from capitalism,
Hmm.
right? Our ability to turn off, to just be and not do, right? Folks have a big issue with that, myself sometimes included, right? Again, not perfect. Um, and these things are important to bring into the conversation because many times, hence why it's my theory, right? Because it's been so effective. When we bring that into the space, it's so liberating, it's so resonant for clients' experiences, especially clients who are located right in a social location with less power and privilege, right? Multiple minoritized identities. So society is in the space, and so we have to make room for it in the dialogues clinically and training.
And maybe that's our advocacy and psychoeducation we provide to the clients when explaining that, because oftentimes there's a lot of individual shame that they experience when what we know is that society has had that impact as well. And so that we're able to lighten that burden by understanding the systems at play that brought this to be. And so it's really validating when understanding that it didn't just happen because I am who I am. It happened because of this other thing that exists outside of me, but that I am forced to interact and engage with, um, no matter kind of the situation. So well received, and I appreciate everything there. So, Mariah, I'll turn it to you. What are some important conversations that you think counselors should be either having with each other or with their clients right now?
Yeah. When it comes to counselor and counselor conversations, let's start asking each other what we're doing. Let's start asking each other what we know. Let's start really holding ourselves as a profession accountable for the things that are happening in our society and what we are doing about it. And I think that this is a really difficult conversation to have, right? There's a reason why we don't usually go straight forward to that, because it's uncomfortable to try and hold us ourselves as a community accountable for that. Start having conversations about the trainings you're taking, the things that you're doing, the advocacy, like show others your allyship and ask them, what's your allyship like?
Hmm. And I think that this is a soft plug to our one of our previous episodes with Dr. Sherdine Simpson, talking about engaging in brave conversations. And so, yes, maybe tough is one way we might contextualize it because of the fear there, but that the product is progress if we are willing to lean into the brave conversation and call in to say, hey, what are we doing about it? How are we collectively doing something? Or what am I doing about it? Maybe it's a self conversation. It's a
Hmm.
look in the mirror, right?
Right. Hold ourselves accountable to the things that we want to do. And I think, right, like when I started in 2019 at SAIGEO, I was still a student. And so, like, there were a lot of different pieces that I was juggling. And there were various points in time where I thought to myself, like, man, I don't know if I can keep doing the SAIGEO representative spot. And then every time I was looking at myself going, this is so important to me. What will it mean for me if I stop doing this? And I haven't stopped, and I can't stop, and I won't stop.
Can't stop, won't stop. Yeah.
Right? Like, let's hold ourselves accountable. Let's hold others accountable, and let's work on turning that inward. Right? Seeing ourselves,
Mhm.
asking ourselves, "What is this an area of growth for me? Is this a place where I want to
Mhm.
do better? How am I going to do better?"
Mhm. Being willing
And
to do that, even just internally, is big and necessary. Chase, I cut you off. Please say something. I apologize.
no, no, it's totally fine. And I just want to add, you know, how are we doing as we're doing this, right? And really showing up in the space for each other in that way as human beings, as counseling professionals, just being there and saying, like, how are you doing as we are doing this, as we are engaging in this advocacy work, especially if the individuals who are engaging in that collective effort are also folks who would be adversely impacted, right? If the effort were actually implemented, right? And so it's important for me, right, as a white cisgender man who is gay, right, to listen and to decenter myself and to be in the periphery, not to leave the room. Do you know what I mean? Not to leave the space, but to move myself, shift myself, right, in terms of where I am in my positioning in the space, so that the folks who are with me in these efforts, though in a different way from me, would be adversely impacted, right, by this legislation, especially as it concerns trans and gender diverse people. So my trans and gender diverse brothers and sisters, right, and so on and so forth, are at the center of this dialogue, though I am here in the space just following their lead, right? And so we want to make sure that we're in the space asking these questions of how are we doing as we're doing this.
Hmm. Hmm. And I appreciate you calling that into the conversation, Chase. It's making me think of the concept of vicarious traumatization, even though that how this impacts our clients can impact us individually, even when we are not trying to center ourselves. And so the the ripple effect is large. And so maybe it's a small sector of the population that's being targeted, but the impact and the implications ripple widespan through multiple systems. And so I think, again, not that I'm trying to center the counselors, but like I think there are certainly impacts that stem out further. And so we have to be aware of all of it.
Yeah. And I'm even going to give you an example for exactly that. We have seen trans sports bans impact cisgender women, cisgender Black women. We have seen cisgender women be accused of being trans after these sports bans have happened because they won. Because they won as a person of color. And so we really can't say that there is no one this will affect. These things will ripple forward into the cisgender heterosexual community. When we talk about gender affirming hormones, this treatment modality was originally created for cisgendered people who were having puberty at the ages of like 6 and 7. Does that mean that those cisgendered people, like for puberty blockers, I apologize, I said hormone replacement therapy, but puberty blockers, will they have access to puberty blockers if these things go forward? And those are cisgendered heterosexual children more often than not.
Hmm. Yeah. And so I think we advocate for, you know, the initial, but we also have to understand the larger picture. A lot of times, what we do in our work with clients is we're trying to get all the pieces of the puzzle, and systemically, I think it's helpful to have all of those pieces of the puzzle as well. I love it. Mariah, I think you started with the conversations counselors should be having with each other. So I don't want to take away if you believe there are important conversations we should also be having with our clients.
Absolutely. There are a lot of different important conversations we should be having with our clients. One of them is acknowledging our privilege and acknowledging if we do not speak from a space of experience, acknowledging how our experiences are different, and therefore our impacts of these things will be different. And then even telling our clients, like, hey, I know that this is something you've brought up, or I know that this is something happening in our legislation. How is it affecting you? Is it affecting you? How does this happen for you? And I think Chase talked a little bit about how, like, even if I'm not the person directly impacted, I'm in the room. And let's be in the room with them. Let's give them that space. I have a few different trans clients who will talk to me about how the people in their life don't realize, and they spend most of their time educating them about this legislation, and that is exhausting. It is taxing. It is difficult to be in that place, especially because very often part of the response is, well, I don't get it, and like dismissive of that difficulty. So let's make that space for them. Let's make it so that when we are having those conversations with our clients, they don't have to educate us about why this information or this legislation is harmful. And instead, we are giving them space to be validated, understood, and really talk about the impacts that this is having on their life.
I couldn't snap louder if I wanted to, but I won't do that in the microphone just because that might really bother some folks. So this has been such a wonderful and meaningful and highly, highly needed conversation. So I want to thank you both for sharing all that you have today and give you one final opportunity to share anything else that you feel like is important for our listeners to hear.
I will say, go ahead, Mariah.
If you're not already, you should be following us on social media.
Okay, if you are not already, let's follow that SAIGEO account. It will be linked also in the show notes for you. And Chase, what did you want to add?
My dear friend and colleague, Mariah, was the recipient just an hour before we started recording of the 2023 Jean Dockery Excellence in Advocacy Award through SAIGEO. And so I just want to commend them, my dear, dear friend Mariah, for all the efforts that they've done this year and will continue to do. And just know that I cherish you as a colleague and as a friend.
It was literally an honor. And I didn't say it in the meeting that we had because I was a little bit shocked. I was like, oh my gosh, it's me. But throughout Jean's time as our GRC, we have seen them really help lead SAIGE through that legislative advocacy, hence why the award was named after them. And so for me, I've always looked up to Jean and seen their like powerhouse of legislative abilities and how passionate they are. And so it's like especially special. I feel even more honored that the award that was named after someone I look up to was also provided to me. So yeah, it was absolutely an honor. And I'm looking forward to the next person who will step up in our legislation and be the next recipient. I will be very honored to provide them that award.
So cool. And I am very honored that you both joined us today on Ohio Counseling Conversations. This, again, has been such a meaningful conversation, and we're so glad that you joined us for this Pride Month episode. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening.
Ohio Counseling Conversations is on a mission to make this podcast meaningful to you, and we can't do that without your help. A feedback form is linked in the show notes for this episode and is also available on the OCA Linktree. If you have any recommendations for topics or guests or any other general feedback, you can let us know by using the form. We welcome your thoughts so that we can continue to develop the podcast and grow as creators. If you are interested in joining the team or being a guest, you can also reach us by emailing ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. We value your insight. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow us so you can stay up to date with Ohio Counseling Conversations online and wherever you listen to podcasts.
This podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Counseling Association's Media, Public Relations, and Membership Committee and its podcast subcommittee. This episode was executive produced by Marisa Cargill. Research and fact-checking by Kaylee Bradley. Editing by Leah Wood. Original music by Elijah Sototerwood. Special thanks to Stacy Tasmer, Shardine Simpson, Dohi Kimapel, Alma Moore, Amy Barcelo, and Chase Morgan-Swaney. Views, beliefs, or references mentioned in this episode do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the Ohio Counseling Association. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect the view of the Ohio Counseling Association or any of its officials. Thank you.